Charlie Ross. In 1874, America's first kidnapping victim for ransom was Charles Brewster Ross, or Charlie as he was commonly known. Even though Charlie Ross's case is almost a century and a half old, it has not been resolved, and his fate is still unknown. Christian K. Ross and his wife Sarah Ann welcomed Charlie into the world on May 4, 1870, in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. He had 3 sisters and 2 brothers. The couple resided in a big estate in Germantown, a wealthy neighborhood of Philadelphia, and were for a while comparatively well off. On July 1, 1874, Charlie and his 6-year-old brother Walter were playing in the family's front garden. Sarah Ann was away in Atlantic City recovering from an illness while Christian spent most of the day working at his store. The children were watched over by the home's servants. When Christian returned home from work, he was not immediately alarmed to find that Walter and Charlie were not in the front garden, as one of the maids claimed they had seen the boys playing out on the street with friends. However, Christian was soon alerted by a neighbor who'd witnessed the boys being taken away in a horse-drawn carriage. It was later uncovered that, over a period of several days, 2 men had supplied the children with sweets. And on July 1st, they'd approached and offered Charlie and Walter not only sweets, but fireworks too. They promised the children they'd get both of these things if they agreed to ride with the strangers. The boys agreed, but shortly after pulling away from their home, 4-year-old Charlie began to cry. Walter was dropped off at a local store and given money to buy fireworks. But when he returns, the kidnappers and his brother were gone. Before we continue, we want to remind you that only a small percentage of people who watch our videos are actually subscribed. So if you enjoy our content, consider subscribing. It's free and you can always change your mind later. Now, let's move on with the video. Walter was soon reunited with his family by a local citizen, but Charlie remained missing. On July 3rd, Christian placed an ad in the local paper offering $300 for his son's safe return. Soon after this, he began to receive ransom letters from the apparent kidnappers. The letters came in the form of notes mailed from post offices in Philadelphia and beyond, and they were written poorly. The handwriting was described as odd, while the writing itself barely literate with extremely poor spelling and grammar. The ransom letters demanded $20,000 for the safe return of Charlie, which is the equivalent of around $450,000 today. The kidnappers cautioned the family against contacting law enforcement and threatened to hurt Charlie if Christian did not cooperate. However, by this point in time, the Ross family had lost a considerable amount of their wealth. Although they continued to live in a large house in an affluent area, Christian's store was beginning to buckle due to the stock market crash of '73, and the family was heavily in debt. As a result, they simply could not afford the ransom demands. The family saw no way out, and so they contacted their local police departments. Several provident Philadelphians enlisted the help of the famous Pinkerton Detective Agency, the same agency which we've covered on a previous episode of Cold Case Detective discussing Dorothy Arnold. The agency printed thousands of flyers and posters featuring Charlie's likeness. And while the police officers conducted one of the 19th century's biggest manhunts, they could not locate the missing 4-year-old. While several attempts were made to deliver the ransom money to the kidnappers, each time the perpetrators failed to appear. After 23 notes, Charlie's abductors ceased communicating with his family. The case took a twist 5 months later when, on the night of December 13th, the house of a judge living in Brooklyn was burgled. The judge's brother, who lived next door, gathered members of his household, and they each armed themselves with weapons and set out to catch the intruders. The men gunned down both burglars, career criminals named Bill Mosher and Joe Douglas, who were recently released from jail. While Mosher was killed instantly, Douglas lived 2 more hours and was able to briefly communicate with the men who had shot him. It seems to be rather unclear exactly what Joe Douglas said that night, but the general consensus appears to be that he admitted that he and Moshe had abducted Charlie Ross. But he also said that his now dead partner knew the current location of the 4-year-old. After this, however, his statements became unclear again. There is some confusion over whether he admitted that Charlie was dead or whether he stated that the boy would be returned to his family in a few days. It seemed to be agreed upon that Douglas would have no reason to lie because he knew he was dying when he confessed. If Charlie was still alive at the time the two men passed away, he was never returned to his family. Soon after this, Walter Ross was taken to New York to see if he could identify Moshe and Douglas as the men who'd taken Charlie that day in July. Walter immediately recognized them, especially Moshe, who had a distinctly malformed nose, as the cartilage had been destroyed by cancer. It was soon discovered that a disgraced policeman named William Westervelt was an associate of Bill Mosher and also his brother-in-law. Westervelt was arrested and held in connection with the case, and in 1875 he was tried for Charlie's kidnapping. While awaiting trial, Westervelt apparently told Christian that Charlie was alive at the time of Mosher's death. However, the former police officer could not be tied to the crime, and Walter insisted that he was not one of the kidnappers. Subsequently, Westervelt was found not guilty of kidnapping, but was convicted of a lesser conspiracy charge and ultimately served 6 years in prison, though he continued to maintain his innocence throughout his sentence. In the first year alone following Charlie's kidnapping, 600 sightings flooded in from all across the country, but sadly, none of them panned out. 2 years after he went missing, Christian's father wrote a book about the case and had it published. He used the money he made from his best-selling novel to continue his search for his son's whereabouts. By 1878, the media frenzy surrounding the case began to piece around. To renew interest, Christian had the book reprinted and began giving lectures in Boston. Both he and Charlie's mother, Sarah Ann, continued to search for their son until the day they passed away. Christian in 1897 and Sarah Ann in 1912. The couple followed copious amounts of leads, interviewed over 570 people, and spent approximately $60,000 searching for Charlie, hoping that one day they could bring him home. In 1924, to coincide with the 50th anniversary of when Charlie vanished, the local papers began reporting on the case again. By that time, Walter Ross was an adult and working as a stockbroker. He reported that he and his siblings continued to receive letters from men claiming to be their missing brother. And during their lifetime, it was found that the siblings investigated around 1,000 impersonators. The most notable of these came from a man named Gustav Blair, who was a 69-year-old carpenter living in Phoenix, Arizona in 1934, when he came forward. He petitioned for the courts to recognize him as the real Charlie Ross, claiming that he'd been abducted as a child and lived in a cave for a time before being adopted by a man who later told him in 198 that he was the missing 4-year-old from Philadelphia and that he had kept him for the kidnappers. The Ross siblings were not happy about this, with Walter exhausted from the years of con men attempting to get a slice of the family inheritance, labeling Blair a crank and saying that he found Blair's story to be unconvincing. He added later that he believed the idea of Charlie still being alive was absurd, stating, "We've long ago given up hope that Charlie would ever be found alive." Despite their unhappiness, the Ross family did not spend time contesting Blair's claims, and so the court ruled that he was Charles Brewster Ross. Even with this, Blair was never acknowledged by the family as their missing brother, and they did not leave him any money or property from their parents' estates. For a short while, Blair moved to LA and attempted to sell his life story to a movie studio, but this endeavor failed. He eventually moved to Germantown, then back to Phoenix with his wife. Blair died in December of 1943, age 73, still claiming to be Charlie Ross. However, his descendants later took a DNA test which conclusively proved he was not the missing child, but really a man named Nelson Miller. The fates of Westervelt, Mosher, and Douglas served as a deterrent to anyone who wished to kidnap for ransom. The next high-profile ransom case did not occur until 1900, when 16-year-old Edward Coude Jr. was abducted while running errands. The case of Charlie Ross was what prompted the famous "don't take candy from strangers" notion, and the Missing Persons Database. The Charlie Project was named after him. Not only this, but as a result of the case, Pennsylvania later became the first state to pass a law changing kidnapping from a misdemeanor to a felony. The Ross family home was torn down in 1926, and Walter passed away in 1943. With him died perhaps the final chance of ever recovering Charlie. It's an odd case because Charlie's location has never been found, but the name of the kidnappers is known, and officials and his family are still unsure of his fate nearly a century and a half later. Moving on to the next case. Dardeen family murder. 3 members of the Dardeen family were brutally killed in their Ena, Illinois, home on November 18, 1987. Keith Dardeen, their father, husband, and leader of the household, was missing and thought to have murdered his family. But the next day, Keith would also be discovered dead. The case would go unresolved even after a serial killer confessed to the murders 10 years later. The year was 1986. Ena was a small rural town of about 490 occupants. The town had a store, bank, gas station, firehouse, and a post office, but nothing else. In 1986, Russell Keith Dardeen, who preferred to go by his middle name, completed his training for his job as a treatment plant operator. Keith was a native of Mount Carmel, and after completing his training, he bought a trailer and moved to Ena to be closer to his job. His wife, Ruby Elaine Dardeen, who was from Albion, would move to Ena with the couple's 2-year-old son, Peter, shortly after. They rented a land close to Keith's job at a water treatment facility in the woodlands beside Route 37 from a nearby farming couple. Keith's wife, Ruby Elaine Dardeen, who too preferred to go by her middle name, worked at an office supply store in Mount Vernon. Keith and Elaine were avid churchgoers, and when they were not working, they played in a musical ensemble in a local Baptist church. Keith was the lead singer while Elaine played the piano. In 1987, Elaine became pregnant with her second child. They were going to name their new child either Ian or Casey, depending upon the gender of the child. As they were welcoming their new child, Keith put up his trailer for sale and decided on moving from the area to a safer place. The area they had been living in had been becoming increasingly violent, and the family did not feel safe living in the area. There had been 15 homicides in Jefferson County during the span of just 2 years. With the increase in violence, Keith became so protective of his family that on one occasion, he refused entry to his home to a young woman who had asked to use their phone. Keith's mother said that Keith wanted to move back to Mount Carmel even if he were unable to find a job, and that he regretted ever moving to Ina. On November 18, 1987, Keith did not show up for work and did not inform anyone that he was not coming to work that day. He was an extremely reliable worker, and his supervisor thought this was out of character for him. He became concerned when calls to his house went unanswered. He then called Keith's parents, who said they hadn't seen him either. Keith's parents became worried when they called and no one answered the phone. Keith's father, Don Dardeen, called the sheriff's office and agreed to drive down to Ina with the spare house key and meet deputies at Keith's house. After reaching the trailer, they knocked on the door, and when no one answered, they used the spare key to enter the trailer. Once inside, they were met with a crime scene so violent and gruesome that it would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Inside, in the same bed, were the bodies of Elaine, her 3-year-old son, Peter, and a newly born baby girl. Both Peter and Elaine had been bound and gagged with a duct tape and beaten to death with a baseball bat found at the crime scene. The baseball bat had been a birthday present to Peter from Keith earlier that year. Elaine had been beaten so grievously that she had gone into labor and given birth to the girl 2 months before her due date. The killer, or killers, took no mercy and beaten the newborn to death as well. Elaine had suffered a blow on the right top of her head that had fractured her skull, and Peter has suffered numerous abrasions and contusions, and his skull was also fractured. At first, Keith was suspected of the crime as he was nowhere to be found. Keith's car, a red 1981 Plymouth, was missing, and police believed Keith murdered his family in a fit of rage and was on the run. However, friends and family did not believe Keith would harm his family. A team was quickly assigned to search for him, but the search quickly ended when a group of hunters found his body in a wheat field approximately a mile away. Keith had been shot 3 times, once in the front skull, once in the right side of the face, and one on the left cheek. His penis was also cut off. His car was parked outside the police station in the town of Benton, 11 miles from his home. His blood was found splattered in the car, and police concluded that he was likely murdered in his car. An autopsy concluded he was likely killed within 1 or 2 hours from the rest of the family. News of the killings caused an unrest among the people living in the area. Many residents bought guns and carried them everywhere to protect themselves. Before the murders, locals used to leave their doors unlocked, but now they checked twice to make sure they were locked. A coroner in a nearby Franklin County said that the locals were so scared to let strangers into their homes that if someone was to run out of gas on a country road, instead of knocking on the doors, they would have a better luck walking the highway or hitching a ride. A total of 30 detectives were assigned to the case, working day-night. More than 100 people were interviewed, but the police were stumped to find a motivation for the killings. No one had anything bad to say about the family. The trailer home was in order with no sign of forced entry. The back door of the trailer had been left open. A VCR, a portable camera, cash, and jewelry were lying in plain sight, but none of it was stolen. The killer or killers had also made an attempt to clean up the crime scene, suggesting they were not in a hurry to leave. Elaine had not been sexually assaulted, and police found no evidence to suggest that Elaine or Keith had any extramarital affairs that could have led to the murders. Police did find small amounts of marijuana in the trailer, but it wasn't enough to suggest that they were involved in drug dealings. In fact, police started to believe that marijuana may have belonged to the killers. The family wasn't known to be in debts or known anyone who held grudges against them. A stack of papers with sports scores were found in the house, and police wondered if Keith had been in gambling debts. However, it was quickly ruled out. The murders were so brutal that the locals started to believe that Satanist cults were responsible. But a police expert ruled them out, as cults often mutilated bodies extensively and leave symbols and lit candles at the crime scene. Police did not believe they were randomly chosen, but that it was very personal. Keith's mother, Joanne, said, "I think someone wanted Keith to sell drugs, and he refused. There's also a possibility that someone liked Elaine and she would not accept his advances, and he took out his rage on both of them. We just don't know." With little leads to follow, the case started to go cold. Joanne worked hard to keep the public interest in the case. She would call the detectives throughout 1990s, offering possible leads she had gathered or asking for any information on the case. She was able to collect more than 3,000 signatures from residents asking the Oprah Winfrey Show to air the case. But the producers of the show turned her down, stating that the crime was too brutal to be featured on daytime television. America's Most Wanted also turned down airing the show at first, but eventually ran a segment in 1998. However, the feature failed to generate any leads. In 1999, Tommy Lynn Sells was arrested for cutting the throats of 2 girls near Del Rio, Texas. One of the girls survived and was able to identify Sells as the killer. He was convicted and sentenced to death for that murder, and another one he committed earlier in 1999. While in prison, he started confessing to a number of other murders that he claimed to have committed while hitchhiking and hopping trains to get around the country. Among these murders, he claimed to have murdered the Dardine family. In 2010, Sells claimed that in November of 1987, while traveling through Jefferson County, he met Keith at a truck stop or maybe a pool hall, and Keith invited him to his home for dinner. After the meal, Sells said Keith suggested to engage in a threesome with him and Elaine. He claimed that this alleged sexual offer had set him off, and in an uncontrollable rage, he murdered the whole family. However, friends and family and the police do not believe this, given how protective Keith was of his family to even consider letting strangers into his home. Sells was interviewed numerous times, and during these questionings, his story changed several times. Sells gave details that were consistent with the general facts that were already reported publicly. When questioned about the information that was kept secret from the public, he was less trustworthy. In 2000, when Sells first confessed, Joanne thought he was the murderer. But as the years passed, she became increasingly certain that he was not at fault. Police were only able to connect Sells to 22 murders, none of which involved the Dardine family, despite his confession to more than 70 homicides. 2014 saw his execution. Moving on to the next case. Jeremy Stoner. On July 16, 1980, Jeremy Stoner was born in California. He had 3 siblings: Justin, his younger brother, and Jason and Joshua, his 2 elder brothers. They resided in the charming and picturesque city of Vallejo, California. Jason was a cheerful and energetic youngster. He cherished his friends and family. He enjoyed going to school and learning new things. He liked to ride his bike, play with his toys, and watch cartoons. He had a bright smile and a big heart. On Saturday morning, February 21, 1987, 6-year-old Jeremy was playing outside with his 2 older brothers aged 9 and 11 near their house. Jeremy and his brothers were being watched by a relative while their parents were at work. The relative had to leave suddenly to take her sick daughter to the emergency room. The boys were told to stay home until their parents returned. Instead, they headed over to a neighbor's house. While there, a neighbor scolded Jeremy for spilling ketchup, and they left. The boy's mother returned home at 4 p.m. to find the house empty, and she assumed the boys were playing at a neighbor's as they often did. But when the 2 older boys returned without Jeremy 2 hours later, the family launched a search effort. With Jeremy nowhere to be seen, they called the police. Vallejo police quickly determined Jeremy had been kidnapped. The last sighting of him was believed to be at a Dairy Queen on Springs Road, about a 5-minute walk from the family home. A worker there told investigators they saw Jeremy with an adult man around 7:30 that evening. 4 days later, on February 25, 1987, Jeremy's body was found on Sherman Island in Sacramento County. 4 people driving down Sherman Island Road in the Delta found themselves stuck in the mud. The driver got out to look for something to wedge under the tires. Instead, she discovered the body of a little boy. He had been assaulted, stabbed, and strangled. They called the police and told them about the discovery they made. Investigators arrived at the crime scene soon after. They collected all the evidence they could and stored it for future use. The news of Jeremy's demise spread quickly in Vallejo. The people were outraged and heartbroken by what happened to him. They felt sorry for his family and wanted to support them in any way they could. They gave them flowers, cards, and hugs. They searched for Jeremy when he was missing. They held a candlelight vigil for him. They also prayed for him and his family. The mayor of Vallejo at that time was Terry Curtola. He said that the people of Vallejo became part of the Stoner family for 4 days. He reiterated that they searched, cried, and prayed for him. It was not long until a suspect walked right into the Vallejo Police Department. About a week after Jeremy lost his life, an unemployed security guard named Sean Quincy Melton told police he may have information about the case. By his own admission, Melton said he wanted to impress detectives with his amateur investigation. He wanted, in his own words, to be a big shot. Video of his interrogation, though, showed the slow transformation of Melton from a swaggering sleuth to a bewildered crime suspect. He had a troubled past and a disturbing mindset, as evidenced by his authorship of a book titled The Wolf's Den, which depicted child exploitation. Although he claimed it was a work of fiction, some doubted that it was entirely detached from his own experiences. Sean Melton voluntarily visited the police station to provide information related to the case. He indicated that he had heard rumors and witnessed certain things that might aid in locating the perpetrator. However, the police held suspicions about his involvement in the crime. Their skepticism regarding Sean Melton was based on a legitimate reason. Before his visit, his psychologist had alerted the authorities and revealed that Sean Melton had confessed to having disturbing fantasies involving young boys. The psychologist expressed concerns that Sean Melton might pose a danger and could potentially be linked to Jeremy Stoner's case. The police subjected Sean Melton to an extensive 30-hour interrogation, during which they posed numerous questions and administered a polygraph test. They also created a sketch of him and compared it to a witness's description of the abductor. Their objective was to obtain information and potentially ascertain his involvement in the case. Sean Melton vehemently denied any involvement in the crime, asserting his innocence and claiming no knowledge of the case. He successfully passed the polygraph test, and the sketch of him did not match the witness's description. He maintained that his sole intention was to assist the police in solving the case. However, the police persisted in their pursuit of Sean Melton and put forward a new hypothesis. They alleged that Sean Melton suffered from multiple personality disorders and suggested that one of his alter egos named John Wolfe could have been the perpetrator. They contended that Sean Melton had no recollection of these actions. In response, the authorities arrested Sean Melton, charging him with kidnapping as well as taking Jeremy's life. Nevertheless, they lacked sufficient evidence to secure a conviction. 2 trials were conducted, but on both occasions the juries could not reach a unanimous verdict. Consequently, the judge was compelled to dismiss the case. Sean Melton passed away in 2000 without ever admitting to any involvement in Jeremy Stoner's tragic fate. The case of Jeremy Stoner remained unsolved for many years, classified as a cold case due to the lack of progress and the absence of fresh leads or evidence. However, in 2023, a significant development occurred in Jeremy Stoner's case. The police received a new lead thanks to an advanced technology known as DNA testing. DNA, a unique genetic code present in every individual's body, can be instrumental in identifying a person or their familial connections. The police harness DNA testing to compare samples obtained from Jeremy's remains with those in a criminal database. This breakthrough held the promise of shedding new light on the long-standing mystery surrounding Jeremy's tragic fate. The police found a match. They finally found the perpetrator. The perpetrator's name is Fred Marion Kane III. 69-year-old Kane was arrested at his home in Central Point, Oregon. District Attorney Krishna Abrams said, "I am so thankful to have such dedicated cold case investigators that no matter how much time goes by, they remain steadfast in their commitment to solving these horrific cases." Media reports from 1984 show Kane, then 30, was suspected of assaulting a 17-year-old in San Bernardino County. Kane and his roommate were arrested on suspicion of assaulting the teen at knife point. Kane was charged with forcible assault and use of a weapon with enhancements for 4 previous prison terms, but was found not guilty by a jury later that year. The Solano County District Attorney's Office said it is not releasing further information due to the ongoing nature of the investigation, but Kane's arrest has likely drawn the attention of police and Martinez. Since the beginning, Jeremy's case was often mentioned in the same breath as that of Eric Coy. In late January 1987, just a month before Jeremy's disappearance, 9-year-old Eric went for a bike ride between his Martinez home and that of a relative's. Eric knew the route well and rode it often. He left home around 11 a.m. with the expectation he would call, as he always did, once he reached his relative's home a few blocks away. When he did not call home, a search was undertaken. His body was found close to Martinez Junior High School. He had been stabbed nearly a dozen times and succumbed to his injuries. To this day, Eric's case remains unsolved. Anyone with information regarding the case is asked to call the District Attorney's Cold Case Unit at 707-784-8477. Kane made his first appearance in court in Solano County on September 28, 2023. The family of Jeremy Stoner was in the courtroom as Kane was brought in. Jeremy's mother, Karen Tabler, said, "I do not know if it is relief. Not feeling good, that is for sure." She added that it was hard to be in the same room as Kane. Paul Sekira, the Chief Deputy District Attorney for Solano County, said, "Well, I do not think you ever get closure. I've been here for a while. Although I've never witnessed families find real closure, I think that someone being held accountable will bring some solace. Moving on to the next case. The Doodler. There was a man sitting in the dark with a pencil, either hidden amid the flamboyantly and elegantly dressed people of Polk Street's lively nightlife, or under the watchful gaze of the fluorescent lights of the bars of the Castro and Tenderloin district. He would be modest and humble in his approach, according to survivors. According to the account, he would sit by himself, probably holding a pen in one hand and a drink in the other, and show guys sketches that he had previously made. One witness remembers seeing sketches of animals in a sketchbook. According to sealed police files, some of the attacks might have started with a drawing on a cocktail napkin. The subject of the makeshift artwork was the unintentional victim of a serial murderer who was furious, as shown by the horrific trail of victims he left behind. The Doodler is a nickname which seems almost light-hearted upon first glance, but to those who lived during his reign of terror, the name represents a very dark period in San Francisco's history, one of fear and uncertainty. He is San Francisco's other serial killer still at large. Overshadowed by the Zodiac and the Zebra killings, the Doodler quietly preyed on those most vulnerable to violence at the time, the LGBTQ population. To date, 5 men between the ages of 20 and 766 have been ruled as victims of this artistically inclined assassin. But while the Doodler has only been publicly linked to cases in San Francisco, there is a chance that he may have continued to kill in other locations throughout the U.S. as well. The Doodler is known to frequent bars located in Castro, Tenderloin, and Polk Street. Those areas were the main hangouts for people who wished to be free of society's scrutinizing eye. Only in those neighborhoods was it safe for 2 people of the same gender to walk hand in hand, as engaging in such brazen acts of homosexuality, while in the more mainstream neighborhoods could result in arrests for some and grievous bodily harm for others. The downtown neighborhood of the Tenderloin, in a similar fashion to how it is today, was home to a swath of affordable housing projects. As it was one of the very few places affordable enough for people who were single and estranged from family to live in San Francisco, the neighborhood became what many called the heart of the gay community from the late 60s until the early 70s. Despite the robust gay nightlife, San Francisco was not perfect by any means, as crimes against the LGBTQ population were rampant. When reflecting on San Francisco through the lens of the hippie movement and the Grateful Dead, it is easy to forget that the city was not always the mecca for the LGBTQ community that the media liked to portray it as. In fact, the now very liberal and inclusive city, hailed as the, quote, gay capital of America, according to a 1964 issue of Life magazine, and home to the free love movement, was not actually as free as it was made out to be, especially for those most vulnerable to society's wrath. Because homosexuality was not decriminalized locally until 1 month before the killings ceased. In the 2 years that the Doodler roamed the streets of the city, gay men had not only to fear the crimes that may be committed against them, but also the very people tasked with protecting them, the police. 2 men found kissing or even simply holding hands in public could yield an arrest, which could then lead to the names, addresses, and workplaces of those arrested, alongside their crimes of culture being publicized. Gay men could lose their jobs, their living spaces, their families, and essentially their lives as they knew it if outed by police. Because of this division, those who were on the receiving end of violence, be it at the hands of the Doodler or other miscreants, had to think twice before going to the police for help, as they were liable to be charged themselves simply for being themselves. While it was not uncommon for members of the LGBTQ community to experience a barrage of hate, especially after dark, a serial killer amidst their ranks was a new threat. The passing of the Consenting Adult Sex Bill in the spring of 1975 paved the way to decriminalizing homosexuality for the most part between consenting adults, yet the divisions and mistrust between the gay community and police still remained, a rocky relationship of which the Doodler took full advantage. The first victim of this artistic yet gruesome serial killer was found on the beach at 48th and Ulloa on January 24, 1974. Locals recall that back then, the dark and quiet sand dunes and cliffs of the area of Ocean Beach was a known location for casual gay hookups after dark. The fog enveloped San Francisco's shoreline like clockwork each morning, and the crime scene would have almost looked peaceful. But upon further inspection, first responders would have been treated to a bloody scene. The victim was Gerald Earl Kavanaugh, a Canadian man who had come to America for work and a better life. 49 years old at the time of his murder, he was known to frequent neighborhoods like the Tenderloin and Polk Street. Stabbed 17 times in the chest, back, and stomach, he was found parallel to the Great Highway. His body was partially submerged in the water. He had a short and stocky build and was balding. He was found with a bloody flashlight next to him. Found on his back face up, Kavanaugh had to be pulled in by first responders so that the ocean could not wash him or any more evidence away into obscurity. A Timex wristwatch and a few dollars were all that the victim had on him besides his bloodied clothes. Autopsy reports show that Kavanaugh was alive and conscious at the time of his stabbing. Evidence for this statement is apparent in the numerous defensive wounds on his hands and arms. He initially remained unidentified, being temporarily known as John Doe 7, as he was the seventh murderer of the year. He was a single man, and therefore detectives had very few details about his personal life from which to develop leads. After the killing, the police asked the media for help, and the San Francisco Chronicle published a piece asking for people to call in with much-needed new information. But the small and short article was buried on page 42, and many may have missed it. Police gave the newspaper a phone number to publish in hopes of acquiring new leads, but no viable witnesses came forward. Kavanaugh is believed to be the doodler's first victim, and while logically all serial killers have to start somewhere, the likelihood that this was the killer's first foray into the world of violence is quite low, and there may be other victims we do not know about. The doodler was not the only serial killer on San Francisco streets during that time period, however. In January, April of 1974, a second wave of random shootings committed by the so-called zebra killers overshadowed the then unrecognized pattern of gay men being violently assaulted and killed. One day in early 1975, 5 people were randomly shot on the streets of San Francisco, and over the next couple of days, people would be randomly shot at left and right. 2 innocent teenagers were gunned down getting a late-night snack. The randomness of the victims terrified both government officials and civilians alike. Parents didn't let their children play on the sidewalk or in parks. No one felt safe, and for a brief moment in time, the streets of San Francisco, normally with jostling crowds full of tourists and locals alike, were ghost towns with only the occasional scurrying citizen making their way from a central place to place while looking over their shoulders constantly. Due to the seriousness of the random killings, the cops would only communicate about the case on the Z or Z channel, thus leading to the killers being dubbed the Zebra Killers. The Zebra Killers had been indiscriminately shooting people walking the city streets in broad daylight, whereas the Doodler, who came out only at night, targeted a specific marginalized minority population, which had already been vilified by police and society as a whole. So it wasn't surprising that one case got more attention than the other from both investigators and the media alike. On top of it all, the infamous Zodiac Killer had been terrorizing the Bay Area and using up valuable police resources since 1968. So it was not only the zebra killings but also the Zodiac killings that further overshadowed a murderer who only targeted the gay population. On January 24th, the Doodler's first victim was found. On January 29th, the zebra killings restarted, and on January 30th and 31st, the Zodiac Killer re-emerged, mailing his first letter in 3 years, mocking police and threatening the public yet again. Perhaps he felt left out. Needless to say, the last few days of the first month of 1974 was turning out to be a somewhat busy week for the 16-man homicide squad of San Francisco, as well as for the media. 5 months later, nearly to the day, a second victim was found on 34th and Fulton by the lake on a path under a big tree. Jay Stevens was discovered on June 25, 1974, by a woman walking along Spreckles Lake in San Francisco. He was found with blood in his mouth and empty pockets. At 6'2", his physique was not only formidable, but he was also street smart. He kept his wits about him by abstaining from alcohol. He was found with 5 stab wounds. The victim was a well-known and deeply cherished local drag performer who went by the stage name Jay. Stevens was a Bay Area native who lived in the East Bay in Concord. Jay's drag queen performances were accompanied by comedy that those who were blessed enough to see him perform recall as being witty and avant-garde. Friends recall he would lip-sync Julie Andrews. He was the star of the bar scene and even had his own show at the PS Lounge called The Jay Stevens Show. He was well known all about town in some of the main gay hangouts such as the Cockpit, Bojangles, and the Gilded Cage. We know most about Stevens' life due to his local pseudo-celebrity status. A star drag queen, his sister recalls that even as a 6-year-old, Stevens would dress as a girl and would go by the name of Caroline. She remembers that when a draft letter came in the 1960s that he finally came out to the military recruiter, and he was of course denied a spot. This brought much shame to his family from their perspective. In 1973, Stevens received an award for his drag work at the Kabuki Theater in San Francisco, and his father, in what was for him a progressive act of acceptance and understanding, attended the award ceremony and bought his son, who was dressed as a woman, a corsage to honor his work and pronounce the acceptance of his true self. In some ways, this was the best last interaction they could have had. Stevens was only 27 years old when he was killed, and the medical examiner later determined that he had died only a few hours prior to his body being found. Witnesses state they saw him at a club the previous day. Based on defensive wounds, the medical detectives wondered, due to the remoteness of the area in relation to the clubs or restaurants, if possibly the killer lured and actually transported his victims himself in order to further isolate them. The third victim, Klaus Christmann, was discovered by a woman walking her dog on July 7, 1974. The woman, all these years later, remembers the moment she found the body vividly. The person who first found and notified the police of the existence of a body on the beach was Talba Weiss, who is now 95. She recalls stumbling upon the corpse of a German man at 6 a.m. while walking her German Shepherd, Moondance. Klaus was found at the base of Vicente Avenue on the beach. His death was visually even more brutal, if that was possible, than that of the previous victim's injuries, as he had considerably more stab wounds than Stevens and had been slashed in the throat several times. While the other victims had been single, Klaus was in a heterosexual marriage with 2 children. Originally from Germany, Klaus had come to America to, quote, achieve something better for himself and his family, as Klaus's daughter phrases it. She went on to say that, quote, many people thought that in America pretty much anything is possible, and you can achieve much more. The 31-year-old had been the owner of a bar which catered to both gay and straight customers alike, and while not publicly out, his daughter recalls believing that there was something he was hiding about his sexuality. In April of 1974, Klaus flew out to visit an American friend that he had met while the American was stationed overseas. From April of 1974 up until his death, Klaus enjoyed the bar scene immensely and was last seen on Saturday night partying at Bojangles, an open and inclusive dance club in the Tenderloin. The Tenderloin was a heavily policed area, but that doesn't mean it was safe. This would be the last time he was seen alive by any known witnesses. Fully clothed, carrying makeup, police report that the deceased's pants were unzipped and open. The stab wounds indicated that the killer used such force and rage in the neck area that the body was nearly decapitated. On May 12, 1975, the 4th victim was found on the Pacific Coast Highway, 1 block from where Kavanaugh's body was found. He was found by a local named Christopher Griffin, a 22-year-old who was out on a walk when he noticed a body near the sand dunes. At first, he thought the form was of a sunbather as it was a beautiful morning, but upon further inspection, the blood was evident. The victim was found stabbed 16 times. This victim was able to be identified quickly as Frederick Kappen, a nurse who had worked locally and was a decorated war veteran. Kappen's death may have started with the killer urging him to use the nearby sand dunes as a sort of private environment for a late-night soiree. The coroner notes, quote, "There was dried blood smeared on the soles of both shoes, on the hands, about the face and upper torso, anterior, lateral, and posterior." Kappen was wearing a corduroy jacket and a striped Picasso shirt when he died. While living, Kappen was a hero, credited officially with saving the lives of 4 Marines in Vietnam. He fought off the enemy and pulled 4 men to safety. He later became a nurse in San Francisco. When his family asked to visit him in the city in 1973, Kappen said no to them because he felt like it was too dangerous due to the Zodiac killings happening as well as the general crime of the city in the 70s. Kappen was an artist himself. His family recalls that he actually had artwork on display at a bar in Seattle. His sister recalls feeling unsettled upon learning about the artistry connection. She wonders if Kappen was perhaps targeted for his passion for art. The next victim, the Doodler's 5th officially, was Harold Goldberg, who was found at the 16th hole of the Lincoln Park Golf Course, a public course by Ocean Beach. He was found in the bushes with the coroner telling a reporter from the Chronicle that his body was hidden in an igloo like cove of brush near the 16th hole of the golf course. Based on the state of decomposition, police believed Goldberg had been dead for around 2 weeks before being found. A Swedish-American immigrant, Goldberg was born on September 11, 198, and had been naturalized to America 20 years before his death. He was the eldest of the known Doodler victims at the age of 66. He had no children nor family, so for some time he remained unidentified. He was found at 9:30 the Sunday morning, just 10 feet off a service road by a hiker. The victim seems to have been attacked with what they thought was a rock and tree branch. These details are consistent with a rage killing like the others, but Goldberg was notably not stabbed. Detectives on the case theorized that due to the incline of the area, the killer could have dropped the knife and had to improvise. The coroner wrote that, quote, "Deceased had no underpants and his blue pants were unzipped." There was also a handkerchief found at the scene that police speculated could have been dropped by the killer. Now the count was 5 men, all had been found dead within 4 miles of each other, all within the last 18 months. The killings would stop in June of 75, but the attacks would not. In July of 1975, police got what was their biggest break yet in the form of 3 failed Doodler killings. The first person the Doodler failed with after successfully killing 5 men was a man known by the media as only the Diplomat. While police are aware and have spoken with this surviving victim, his identity is unknown to the public. He is believed to be from a country in Northern Europe and is, according to police, still residing in the Bay Area and living as a gay man. While reporters have made attempts to track down the surviving witness, narrowing down the country of origin is difficult, as consulates in San Francisco were numerous back then as they are today. Rumors around the SFPD were that it may have been a Swedish diplomat known to frequent the Nubel, an inclusive piano bar. While the diplomat currently refuses to cooperate anymore in the investigation, his original statement held many important pieces of information. According to the police, the diplomat recalls that he first encountered the Doodler at 2 a.m. in July of 1975. He recalls that the gay bar, the Rear End, had just closed for the night, and its patrons were making their way to the next open and welcoming establishment for a carb-fueled after-party at the popular Market Street diner called the Truck Stop. It was there in the diner that the unnamed diplomat recalls meeting the artist. He remembers the artist reveling in the attention that he was receiving from drawing images of animals on napkins. According to police, the diplomat then invited the artist, who did not give his name nor was he asked for it, to his nearby high-rise residence at Fox Plaza at 1390 Market Street. His exact address was not disclosed for privacy reasons, but the police state that upon hearing the exact location, the doodler said, "You must have a pretty good view there." The diplomat recalls that the artist then went to the restroom, locked the door, and did not come out for a bit. Miffed but intrigued, the diplomat was not on guard and had his back turned when the doodler finally came out. He was then stabbed repeatedly with a steak knife. As he was being stabbed in the back, the killer was making attempts to turn him around to stab his chest area as well. The diplomat recalls the killer saying, quote, "You guys are all alike." In what was a stroke of luck for the victim, and perhaps bad planning on the part of the killer, the steak knife broke. No information on the origin of the steak knife is given in the media, as this is still an open case and some facts need to be withheld to preserve the integrity of the case in hopes of a conviction. But it could be reasoned that the killer found an impromptu weapon either at the diner or at the victim's home, and that is why the attack ultimately failed. It is unknown the exact weapon used in past cases, but the injuries of the doodler's past victims indicate that something much sharper and more durable would have been needed to make such fatal and numerous injuries. In what some would say was a very foolish decision, less than 2 weeks after the attack on the diplomat, the doodler returned to Fox Plaza, going up to the very same floor the diplomat lived on. In what may have been a case of mistaken identity or some sort of misappropriated need to finish the job no matter who the man was, the killer talked his way into an apartment just a few doors down from the diplomat. He got inside under the guise of needing to use the phone and was able to bind the man's hands and feet before the man screaming and pounding on the wall attracted the attention of neighbors who thankfully alerted the building's security. But the doodler was able to slip out, unnoticed in the ensuing commotion. The second failed victim, who has since passed according to Kevin Fagan, an investigative journalist who has published several pieces on the case and to whom the resurgence of media attention to the case can be attributed, also stated that the killer kept repeating the phrase, quote, "You guys are all alike." Unsatisfied and undeterred, the killer tried unsuccessfully for a third time, this time targeting not a diplomat but an actor that police state was well known enough in America to be fearful of being outed. The actor stated that after inviting the artist back to his residence and into his bed, the killer slipped up and allowed a concealed knife to fall from his long-sleeved jacket. Some wonder, especially due to obscure statements made about the unnamed actor, if he may have been Rock Hudson or Cary Grant. Both were said to frequent San Francisco's gay bars in the 70s, and both were outed in the latter years of their life. They both passed in the 80s, and their families have no comment. Fagan, a reporter for the SF Chronicle, does not disclose the identity of any of the victims due to their right to privacy. In all three aforementioned cases, the surviving victims did eventually file police reports, but they refused to testify in court due to the societal implications of their sexual orientation being revealed. While all three were not comfortable testifying, they all had interacted closely with the doodler and could provide police a thorough physical description, something investigators desperately needed in order to drum up new leads. The diplomat had the best recollection of his attacker. He stated that the killer was African American, young, perhaps between the ages of 19 and 23, tall and lanky. He was described as having a narrow face with high-set cheekbones. The eyes were described as wide-set, and the diplomat reportedly said that they had a calm look to them. It should be noted that psychopaths are often observed as having an eerily calm affect, and their eyes can be described as dead or devoid of emotion, which some may perceive as calmness. With the diplomat's physical description in hand, in October of 1975, a sketch was made of the killer with the statement "serial killer" on the loose written underneath. It was shared with the public via the Centennial, a queer newspaper at the time which had been dutifully covering what mainstream media had neglected to report. A week later, the San Francisco Chronicle chose to publish it as well. By now, there had been 5 murders and 3 attempted murders related to the artist that police knew of, and time was of the essence to stop another attack. If the public knew anything, they needed to share it with police. And then a potential break. That month, a secretary of a psychiatrist from Highland Hospital called police claiming her boss was actually seeing the doodler as a patient. But as the public was in a frenzy as the sketch of the suspect had just been released, her tip was buried under numerous others. When patient was still free 10 days later, the secretary at Highland Hospital called police again, agitated at the inaction and this time providing a license plate number for further identification purposes. 3 days later, the actual psychiatrist came forward and informed the police that, yes, one of his patients had confessed during a session that he was in fact the doodler and that he had committed the murders on Ocean Beach due to his hatred of being gay. The psychiatrist said that, in addition to the confession, his patient looked an awful lot like the sketch artist image that was circulating. The therapist stated that in addition to the murder confession, the patient had also admitted that he was having difficulty with his sexuality, but that talking to the psychiatrist helped. This fit with the self-hating theory, as many who have studied the case postulate that the killer was likely a gay man himself and harbored feelings of self-hatred and rage due to a lack of personal and societal acceptance. While the patient was most likely under the impression that confidentiality laws bound their conversations to secrecy, mandated reporting laws were updated in 1975 to include therapists, and the imminent threat that his patient faced to the public allowed the medical professional to discuss his session notes with police. With the name in hand, the police followed up with the patient, and while he told them he did used to struggle with his sexuality, he said that he had a girlfriend now and was doing well. With no concrete evidence linking him to the crime, as DNA technology was not sufficient enough to tie him to the crime scene or the bodies, the police could only watch him from afar, which they did dedicating many man-hours to suspect surveillance. And while the police couldn't declare victory without a suspect in jail, the public began to breathe easier when, after that initial interview, the attacks stopped, at least locally. After the suspect was interviewed, and of course denied involvement, he took a strange roundabout trip through the United States. He went from the Bay Area to the South, then up the East Coast, and then to the Midwest, a trip with unknown purposes, although detectives allude to similar cases happening in subsequent areas but have refused to give further information due to the cases still being open. Police point to some suspiciously similar cases in Louisiana, however, but decline to give further details. Many coincidences tie this unknown patient to the murders, but not enough to convict. It was not until January of 1976 that this gruesome serial killer was finally referred to officially as the Doodler by mainstream media, so chosen, of course, due to his habit of luring victims with his impromptu art. In the wake of 5 unsolved and brutal stabbings and at least 3 attacks, the SF Chronicle made the Doodler front-page news. However, the delay, clearly political in nature due to the legality and perception of homosexuality prior to 1976, clearly impacted the direction of the case, with fresh witnesses and leads all but dried up in the ensuing years. Some wonder why the 3 survivors were so intent on keeping quiet. Did the killer somehow threaten their careers? Was their fear of being outed stronger than their thirst for justice or their desire to rid the streets of a serial killer? The justification behind such silence is unknown. While it has been over 40 years since the attacks and the age of the remaining victims would probably indicate they might be off of social media, their respective job titles at the time of the attack would indicate that they may still be in the public eye and may be willing to come forward now, knowing that the stigma surrounding same-sex interactions has been somewhat lessened and that any outcries would be treated in the strictest of confidences, and any new information gleaned from these interviews would be private according to police procedure. In hopes of drumming up new leads, police released an age progression depicting what the Doodler may look like in 2018 at the estimated age of 63-69. In 2018, they also talked to the patient himself, who reiterated his innocence but also unknowingly allowed detectives to get a DNA sample from him, which could be used against him in the future. 2019 brought a new life to the cold case. After police released an updated sketch, the lead inspector, Inspector Cunningham of the SFPD, officially reopened the case, asking the public for tips and offering new rewards. Inspector Cunningham tried to find out who the psychiatrist turned tipster was, but the psychiatrist's name was not recorded in the surviving 50-year-old paper police files, and the only mention of his name is written as Doctor. Priest Psych equals C. Highland Hospital. This had the doctor's name spelled like one would spell that of a Catholic priest, but a podcast by Kevin Bacon in the San Francisco Chronicle published in April of 2021 claims that they might have actually found the psychiatrist who canceled the alleged doodler. His name sounds like priest, but is actually spelled Preece, Preece, doctor. Howard Preece was a psychiatrist who lived and practiced in the Bay Area in the 1970s. It is believed his name was misspelled in the records. It was confirmed that Preece was working at Highland Hospital around the time of the killings. He had spent years counseling U.S. Army troops in Germany and had also counseled inmates at Salinas Valley State Prison. Dr. Preece, however, died in 2005, so there is no way to confirm if he was the psychiatrist or not, and currently Kevin Fagan, the creator of the podcast, is looking for any relatives who may recall more information. The police revealed that the suspect identified simply as the patient in 1970s was most likely believed to be the doodler, but he could never be charged. The police updated the sketch of the killer and offered a $100,000 reward for information leading to his arrest. They also released the original recording of the 911 call placed by the unknown male when the first victim was found. However, 45 years have elapsed since then, and many believe that most of the surviving victims and witnesses are either dead, untraceable, or do not want to be found. In 2020, the police submitted DNA taken from the bloody clothes of the victims recovered from the crime scenes, but so far there has been no match. It is difficult to separate two unique patterns of DNA, especially from so old a case. The blood on the clothes was primarily the victim, but the suspect may have cut himself in the process. Based on police reports containing similar victim profiles and modus operandi, there may be a total of 16 brutal murders attributed to the doodler, as well as countless attacks. Investigators believe he is still at large today, with certain evidence that he is currently living as an openly gay guy in the San Francisco East Bay, aged and not yet held accountable. Murder has no statute of limitations, and the case is still open. Investigators involved in the case emphasize that the killer will remain free to strike again unless someone comes forward with fresh information, or until DNA technology advances enough to compare the collected DNA with artifacts from previous crime scenes, most notably a handkerchief they believe may have been used by the perpetrators. Daniel Cunningham, a homicide cold case investigator, can be reached at 415-553-9515 by anyone with information on this crime or potential leads. You can text a tip to 847-411 or phone the SFPD tip line at 415-9575-4444 if you would like to stay anonymous. Thanks for watching. We hope you enjoyed exploring these intriguing cold cases with us. If you found the video fascinating, don't forget to give it a thumbs up and subscribe to Cold Case Mystique for more deep dives into unsolved mysteries. Your support helps us bring you more compelling content. Leave a comment below with your thoughts or any cases you'd like us to cover next. See you in the next video, and remember, the search for truth never stops.